The deputy arrived on the third day after the burial, while the ground was still too frozen to have settled properly over Callum Bodell's grave. Saoirse stood in the doorway of the claim shanty with Finn on her hip, the boys breathing thin and wet against her collarbone, and she watched the man ride up through sleet that fell sideways rather than down. He did not remove his hat. He unfolded a paper that smelled of courthouse coal smoke and read it aloud because the law required it, his voice flat as creek ice, his eyes fixed somewhere above her left shoulder, in the way of men delivering news they prefer not to own. The paper said Callum Bodell owed $32 to Strix General in Atkinson, and that interest would begin accruing after Christmas at 1.5% monthly. Saoirse took the paper with her right hand. She did not allow her fingers to shake, though her forearm ached from 2 days of splitting cottonwood with a hatchet whose edge had gone dull before November. Wren pressed herself against the back of her mother's leg, 7 years old, and already counting the woodpile with her eyes, the way Saoirse had taught her to count everything that winter, not from hope but from necessity. The deputy touched his hat brim. His horse stamped and blew a cloud of steam into the gray air. He said he was sorry for her trouble in the tone of a man who has said it many times and believes it somewhat fewer. Saoirse said nothing. She watched him ride back down the track road until the sleet swallowed him. Then she looked at the paper in her hand, then at the woodpile stacked against the east wall of the shanty where Callum had calculated it would dry fastest. 1.25 cords of a mixed cottonwood and willow. Callum had said 6 cords minimum. He had died hauling the second load when the wagon tongue snapped on the frozen track and the cottonwood poles came down across his chest. She folded the paper along its original creases and set it on the table beside the flour ledger where she kept the household accounts. Then she went back to the stove because Finn's chest was tightening toward evening, as it always did, and the room needed to stay above freezing, and the stove needed feeding whether or not she had enough wood to feed it through January. This was the inheritance. This was the arithmetic. $9 in coin, $38 in store credit, already spoken for by flour, salt, coffee, and lamp oil. 1 cow whose milk was thinning. 2 hens that had stopped laying when the cold arrived in October, 9 days before Callum died. A dull hatchet, a borrowed hand auger, 1 cracked cast iron box stove with a firebox that leaked ash from the lower left corner. The shanty itself, 16 by 20 feet dirt floor, 3 framed walls. 1 wall of tar paper nailed over bare framing where Callum had planned to add boards in spring. The roof was sawed lumber over poles, and it leaked when the temperature climbed above freezing. The stovepipe ran straight up through a tin collar in the roof, and on still nights the draft pulled well enough. On windy nights, smoke backed into the room until Finn's coughing bent him double. The Homestead Act said a widow could hold her husband's 160 acres. She could prove up, she could farm, she could own the land outright in 3 more years if she stayed and worked it. What the act did not say was how she was supposed to stay through a Nebraska winter with half the fuel she needed and a sick child and $32 of debt that would compound monthly starting in 6 days. The nearest family was an aunt in Ohio who had not written in 3 years. The train east cost more than Saoirse had. Walking was not survival. Staying was barely survival, but staying was the only mathematics that did not end at 0. She understood this the way she understood the woodpile, not with feeling, but with measurement. Amos Greer came 4 days after the burial on a Thursday morning when the temperature had not risen above 8 degrees since the previous weekend. He was 52, a Holt County carpenter who had framed 30 claim roofs and lost 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite the winter he arrived, and who now wore a glove with the last 2 fingers sewn shut and never mentioned it. He had not been asked to come. He came because he understood lumber and cold in the way that men who have nearly died of a thing understand it not as theory but as sensation, as a memory in the body that informs every subsequent judgment. He walked the claim the way a man walks a sick animal. He started at the woodpile and pulled a piece of cottonwood from the middle of the stack, turned it in his hands, knocked it against his knee. The sound it made was dull, not sharp. Green wood. It would burn, but it would burn wet and slow and give perhaps half the heat of seasoned wood, and it would deposit tar in the stovepipe faster than dry wood, and a tarred pipe in a tight draft could catch. He set it back. He examined the south wall, pressing the tar paper with his palm. The wind pushed back. He looked at the stovepipe. He looked at the roof poles. He walked the perimeter of the dirt floor and noted where the cold radiated up from the ground near the edges, where the stove's heat did not reach. Then he stood in the center of the room with his hat in his hands and spoke to Saoirse the way he would have spoken to a man directly without cushioning. Because cushioning was a form of condescension, and he knew it. She had maybe 3/4 of a cord of green wood. She needed 6 cords minimum for this room. She did not have 3. She did not have 2. The pipe was intact, but the stove leaked ash from the firebox corner, which meant the seal was failing, which meant heat was escaping below the firebox door instead of pulling up through the flue. The south wall needed to close before the first real storm, and closing it would cost $11 in lumber and tar paper and nails, and she had 9. He did the math aloud so she could check it herself, which he understood she would. Finn coughed from the bed as if to confirm. Saoirse stood with her arms folded and did not interrupt. When Amos finished, she asked what his recommendation was. He said the only honest answer was more fuel hay twists, cow chips, whatever she could gather, but that those burned fast and gave weak heat, and she would spend her days feeding the stove instead of her children. He looked at the tar paper wall one more time. Then he said he was not telling her to leave. He was telling her the numbers. He left without promising to return. And at the track road, he stopped to tell Dorothy Haas's oldest boy, who was passing with a milk pail, to let his mother know that the widow's stove was leaking and her wood was green. Ward Strick came the following day, the 5th after the burial. He rode a roan mare that was better fed than anything on the Bodell claim, and he wore a coat with a fur collar that announced, without his having to say a word, his distance from manual labor. He was 44, lean-faced with clean nails and the careful eyes of a man who had been calculating other people's situations since before he could read. He owned Strick's General and Atkinson, sold coal on commission, and had purchased 3 failed homestead claims in the past 2 years at prices that made the sellers weep in private and made Strick quietly richer. He stood in the doorway because Saoirse did not invite him inside. He opened his ledger and read the account aloud. $12 for nails in August, $14 for the stove repair in September, $6 for flour, total $32, interest after Christmas. Saoirse told him she was aware of the debt. Strick closed the ledger and looked past her at the room, at the cracked stove, at the tar paper wall, at Wren sitting on the bed with Finn's hand in hers. His expression did not change. It was not a cruel face. It was the face of a man who had learned to read the interior of a claim shack the way a doctor reads a patient, and who had decided something before he arrived that he was now going to present as generosity. He offered her $30 for the claim. Cash signed today, out before Christmas. She could stay through the holiday and then find work in town. The offer was precisely calibrated. $30 would not cover the debt. It would leave her with nothing after she settled with him, but it would erase the interest, and Strick would own 160 acres that would be worth 10 times that when the railroad spur came through the South Quarter, which he had reason to believe would happen within 4 years. Saoirse looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him at the track road, at the flat white distance of the Nebraska plain in December, at the sky that offered nothing. No. Strick's expression did not shift into anything hostile. It shifted into something more patient and therefore more dangerous. Prairie makes its own offers, Mrs. Bodell, his voice even and not unkind. Mine will look generous come February. He touched his hat, turned his mare, and rode back toward Atkinson at a pace that suggested he was in no hurry because he had decided she would come to him eventually. Saoirse watched him go. She felt the cold press through the tar paper wall at her back, the wind finding the gaps the way it always found them, and she stood there until the roan mare was a brown smear against the white, and then nothing at all. Then she went inside and stood at the table and wrote the numbers in the flour ledger by lamplight. Wood remaining 3/4 cord. Wood needed at least 5 cords more. Cash $9. Store credit spoken for. Coal cost for winter at Strick's prices more than $40. Team and wagon to haul it not available. Callum's cousin having reclaimed the horses the week after the funeral, which was his right and also the difference between life and death. She wrote a word at the bottom of the column that her father had used when he was teaching her to take stock of a difficult situation, reckoning. The number that mattered most was not 32, not 9, not 40. It was January. January was the number she could not negotiate with. Dorothy Haas received Amos's message from her son at supper and sat with it for a day before deciding what it meant. She had 4 children and a husband who was alive, and a house with 4 framed walls and enough coal to see February. And she had already arrived at a private conclusion about Saoirse Bodell that she would not speak aloud for several weeks. The conclusion was that the widow would not last through January. It was not a cruel conclusion. It was a practical one. Arrived at through the same arithmetic, Saoirse was running by a woman who understood what the numbers on the Nebraska plains meant when they came up short. The days shortened. Saoirse split cottonwood with the dull hatchet, and each piece split poorly because the grain was wet and tangled, and her right shoulder began to ache in a way it had not ached before. Deep in the joint, the kind of ache that did not respond to rest, because there was no rest to offer it. She burned 1 armload of wood each morning and 1 each evening, kept the stove just hot enough to cook porridge and hold the room above freezing. By the second week of December, the wood pile had declined to what she estimated was half a cord. At that rate, she would exhaust it before the second week of January. She tried hay twists. She and Wren walked the frozen prairie, pulling dead grass from under the crusted snow, twisting it into tight bundles the length of a forearm. The bundles burned in 4 minutes. To maintain the stove on hay alone would require a full day of twisting and feeding, and the heat was thin enough to keep the room above freezing on a still day, insufficient to warm wet mittens or ease the tightness in Finn's chest that worsened when the temperature dropped below zero. She tried the dried cow chips. They burned and they held heat longer than the hay, but the smoke was thick and acrid, and Finn coughed worse with each burning. She considered coal. At Strick's prices, coal cost $1.75 per hundredweight, plus the cost of hauling it 3 miles from Atkinson, and she had no team. The mathematics were not close. They were not in the same territory as close. On the night of December 9th, she let the fire go out. Not from carelessness, from calculation. Every piece of wood she burned before the solution mattered was a piece she could not burn after it, assuming there was an after. She pulled both quilts over the children and sat beside the cooling stove with her hands in her lap and watched the coals go from orange to red to the color of old rust. The stove gave up its heat in less than an hour. Within 90 minutes, the iron was barely warm to the touch. Within 2 hours, she could press her palm flat against the top of the firebox without flinching. She had placed a flat piece of fieldstone beside the stove door weeks earlier when she first arrived in Nebraska to catch the ash that scattered when she opened the firebox. It was a piece of quartzite the size of a large dinner plate, dense and gray, unremarkable. She had not thought about it since she set it there. She touched it. It was warm, not hot, not stove hot, nothing that would have registered as significant in a warm room. But the stove iron had gone cold. The air in the room was beginning to bite. Her breath was visible when she leaned forward, and the stone held something the iron had already surrendered. She dripped water from the kettle onto its surface. The drops hissed. She sat on the floor and pressed her palm flat against the quartzite and felt the warmth move into her hand, and something in her chest shifted. Not hope exactly, which was a word that required too much, but the sensation of a door being opened that she had not known was closed. Her father's name was Thomas Bodell. He had been a stonemason's assistant in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, hired by the diocese to repair and maintain the stone walls and flues of St. Michael's Church on Penn Avenue and 3 smaller parish buildings nearby. Saoirse had followed him to work on Saturdays from the time she was 6 years old, carrying his water jug and his lunch pail and learning to be quiet while he worked because the stonework required listening as much as striking. He had hands like the stone. He worked heavy, gray-jointed, capable of delivering either precision or force, depending on what the situation asked. One afternoon in the winter, when she was 8 years old, he brought her into the bake room behind the church hall, where a stone channel ran from the bake oven's firebox through a thick interior wall before connecting to the main chimney. The bake oven had been cold since that morning. The bakers had gone home. The room was empty and dim and smelled of ash and old flour. Thomas pressed Saoirse's small hand against the stone wall beside the oven channel, held it there, and waited. The wall was warm. She could feel it clearly, not imagined warmth, not the ambient warmth of a room with a recent fire, but heat emanating from the stone itself, deliberate and steady, 4 hours after the last flame. Her father explained it in the way he explained everything plainly without performance in the language of a working man who expected to be understood. The smoke from the oven did not travel straight to the chimney. It traveled first through a channel built into the stone wall, a path designed to lengthen the smoke's journey before it escaped. As the smoke moved through the channel, the surrounding stone absorbed its heat. When the fire was out and the smoke was gone, the stone held what it had taken and it gave that heat back slowly through the hours, warming the room through the night, maintaining comfort long after the fuel was spent. The fire's been out since morning, he said, but the stone remembers Saoirse. The stone remembers everything the fire told it. He did not call it engineering. He called it thrift, the Scots-Irish word for not wasting what you could not afford to lose. She had stored this away the way children store things their parents say without urgency, without understanding that she would need it. It had lived in her for 26 years, unexamined the way certain tools live, at the back of a shelf, until the day a specific problem makes them indispensable. Sitting on the dirt floor of a Nebraska claim shanty in December of 1887, with a dying stove and half a quart of green wood, and a sick child, and a debt she could not pay, and a door she could not go through without leaving everything. The memory returned with the force of something that had been waiting. The stovepipe rose straight through the roof. The smoke climbed from the firebox, heated the iron pipe for 5 feet, carried the warmth it had taken from the burning wood, and then it was gone into the Nebraska sky, taking every degree of heat it still held, giving it to the wind, which gave it to no one. What if it did not leave that way? What if before the smoke rose it traveled? She knelt beside the stove and looked at the dirt floor. She looked at the flat quartzite stone that still held warmth while the stove iron had gone cold 2 hours ago. She looked at the stovepipe, a chimney that did nothing but carry heat away as fast as the fire could produce it. And she took a stick of kindling from the box beside the stove and drew in the ash that had settled on the tabletop. The drawing was rough. It was also, she understood, as the lines formed, the only honest possibility she had left. Instead of the pipe rising immediately through the roof, it would descend from the stove collar and turn horizontal, running at a shallow angle through a trench dug into the dirt floor. A channel lined with clay drain tiles packed tightly on all sides, with dense glacial stones sealed above with flat capstones and clay, the whole buried under the floor level. The smoke would travel through this buried channel, and as it moved, the surrounding stone would drink its heat, the same principle her father had shown her in the bakeroom wall, applied to the ground beneath her feet. The floor above the trench would radiate. The stones would hold. After the fire died, the warmth would remain. The problem was draft. Smoke does not travel sideways willingly. Every chimney in Holt County worked because hot smoke rose and rising smoke pulled fresh air into the firebox, and that pull the draft was what kept the fire alive. A horizontal run would fight the draft. The smoke would have no reason to move forward unless it had somewhere to go that offered less resistance than backing up into the room. At the far end of the buried run, the channel would connect to a vertical chimney, a proper stack built tall enough that its pull would reach back through the horizontal section and drag the smoke forward. The smoke would enter the buried channel, surrender its heat to the stone over 14 feet of travel, and then rise through the vertical chimney at the north wall and exit into the sky cooler, slower stripped of most of what it carried. The draft was the gamble. If the vertical chimney pulled hard enough, the system would work. If it did not pull, if the horizontal run killed too much of the pressure differential, the smoke would find the path of least resistance, which was backward through the stove collar and into the room where her children slept. She knew this. She drew the measurements in the ash with the kindling stick. Trench 14 feet long, 2 feet wide, 30 inches deep. 8-inch clay drain tiles, each joint packed with wet clay mixed with fire ash and chopped dried grass. Slope 1 inch of rise for every 4 feet of horizontal run, tilting toward the chimney base so gravity assisted the flow. Thermal mass approximately 3,000 pounds of fist-sized glacial cobbles, quartzite, and granite. Nothing layered, nothing that would crack when heat found moisture in the seams. 2 clean-out ports at intervals accessible through capped crockery set into the floor. She set down the kindling and looked at what she had drawn. It was not genius. It was memory desperation and arithmetic. Her father's bakeroom translated into Nebraska dirt by a woman who could not afford to be wrong. She could see 4 ways it would fail, each of them fatal. If the draft failed, smoke would fill the room. If the clay cracked from heat expansion, or ground frost, carbon monoxide could seep through the floor silently without smell, without warning. If the trench collapsed under the weight of the stones and the foot traffic above, she would lose her only heat source in the middle of the worst month of the year with no means to restore it. If Amos was right, if the physics simply would not allow smoke to travel 14 feet of buried pipe, she would have torn apart her floor, burned her remaining time, and left her children in an unheated room with a hole where the stove connection used to be. She sat with those 4 failures for a long time. The lamp burned low. Finn's breathing steadied in sleep. Wren had pulled both quilts over her brother and curved around him in the dark, her small back rising and falling with a steadiness that Saoirse watched until she was certain it would continue. Then she redrew the measurements more precisely. Then she went to bed. In the morning, she began to gather stones. Dorothy Haas saw her at the frozen slough 2 days later, pulling cobbles from the ice shelf with bare hands. Saoirse's fingers were red and split at the knuckles, and she was sorting the stones as she freed them, pushing aside the flat layered pieces, keeping the round quartzite, piling them into a grain sack that was already heavy enough to make her shoulders ache. Dorothy stopped her wagon on the track road and looked down at this for a moment before she spoke. She asked what Saoirse was hauling rocks for. Saoirse explained the design. Dorothy listened in the way of a woman who suspects the speaker has come unmoored but is too well-mannered to say so before the explanation is complete. When Saoirse finished, Dorothy was quiet for a time. "A warm stone will not feed a stove," Dorothy said. "You need fuel, not a grave under your floor." Saoirse said she had calculated the fuel. She did not have it. She could not get it. The numbers were what they were. Dorothy shook her head. "You are going to tear up your floor, bury a pipe in frozen ground. Hope that smoke decides to crawl sideways because you ask it nicely. If it does not work, your children sleep with no heat and a hole where the stove used to be." "If I do nothing," Saoirse said, "my children sleep in a room where the wood runs out in January. The hole in the floor is a chance. Running out of wood is not." Dorothy had no answer for that arithmetic. She drove on without offering to help carry stones. The gossip moved faster than her wagon. By the following afternoon, Amos Greer's phrase had reached Strick's counter and multiplied. A chimney laid down like a dead snake. Men waiting for the mail delivery repeated it with the satisfaction people take in observing a mistake they predicted. Strick added his own ornament, telling customers that grief had turned the widow's floor into a cemetery, that she was burying her stovepipe because her mind had given way under the weight of widowhood. He said it without malice, which made it more effective. He also quietly stopped the Bodell account's remaining credit. Not dramatically. He simply let it be known that he could not extend financing to experiments. If she needed flour, she could pay cash. Strick's offer of $30 remained on the table unspoken, but present, the way a door left slightly open is always an argument. On the 4th day after she began gathering stones, Saoirse stood in the trench she had started digging, 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, a foot deep so far, the frozen earth below the surface crust, fighting the spade with every stroke, and she looked at what remained to do. 10 more feet of trench. Drain tiles from the abandoned claim 2 miles east, where a failed drainage project had left a row of 8-inch clay tiles, half buried in dead grass. 14 trips at 4 tiles each, carrying them in the grain sacks 2 miles each way in boots that were beginning to separate at the soles. 3,700 pounds of stone to sort, wash, in place. A chimney to frame and seal at the north wall. Clay to mix and pack into every joint with enough precision that no gap wider than a pencil lead remained anywhere in the system. She poured a pot of boiling water into the far end of the trench line to soften the earth. Then she picked up the spade and continued. The woodpile had 7 days left in it at current burn rates. The system, if it worked, would change that calculation entirely. If it did not work, 7 days was 7 days regardless. She drove the spade into the frost-softened earth, broke it loose, lifted it, turned it into the grain sack beside the trench. Finn called from the bed that the trench looked like a river with no water. She told him it would carry something better than water. He considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old and then asked for porridge. Wren climbed down from the bed and began carrying stones from the pile by the door to the trench, one at a time, both arms wrapped around each one. She did not ask whether this would work. She did not ask what would happen if it did not. She was 7 years old, and she had watched her mother look at the numbers for 3 weeks without flinching. And she had decided in the wordless way children decide things, that her mother's looking at the numbers was itself a kind of answer. Saoirse dug. The trench reached 6 feet by the end of the second day of digging, which meant it had taken 36 hours of work to cover ground a man with a pickaxe might have crossed in an afternoon. Saoirse did not measure herself against that man. She measured herself against the calendar, which was indifferent to effort and cared only about outcome. 6 feet done, 8 feet remaining. Woodpile at roughly 5 days if she burned carefully, 4 if the temperature dropped further, which the northwest sky suggested it intended to do. Wren had developed a system for the stones without being asked to develop one. She filled her apron with cobbles from the sorting pile, by the door walked them to the trench edge, set them down individually with both hands, the way she handled eggs, then walked back. She did not run. Running wasted energy, and she had absorbed this from her mother without either of them articulating it. Finn sat on the bed, counting each stone as Wren set it down, his voice still hoarse from the previous night's coughing. He reached 94 before his chest caught, and he had to stop, and Wren told him she would keep the count from there. The gossip had acquired texture by the second week of December. At Strick's counter, where men gathered most mornings under the pretense of collecting mail that arrived only 3 times weekly, Amos Greer's phrase had been elaborated into a small entertainment. Someone added that the widow was going to freeze her children solid, and Strick would buy the claim for back taxes in March. Someone else suggested that grief had a particular way of expressing itself in women alone on the plains, that the mind sought occupation when the heart had nothing useful to do. These were not cruel men in the way that city cruelty is cruel. They were practical men who had survived Nebraska winters by respecting what chimneys required, and to them, the buried pipe was as irrational as trying to breathe underwater because you had run out of air above the surface. Strick said nothing to amplify the mockery. He did not need to. He extended no new credit to the Bodell account, confirmed to 3 separate customers that his offer for the claim remained open at $30, and went about his business with the patience of a man who understood that winter was the most persuasive salesman on the Nebraska plains. Every day that passed without Saoirse resolving her fuel problem was a day that moved the arithmetic closer to his position. On December 12th, 6 days into the digging, Saoirse fitted the first clay tile into the trench and discovered the problem that stopped her cold. The stove collar, the iron ring where the stovepipe connected to the body of the stove, was round, cast to a specific diameter, machined to mate with standard iron pipe. The clay drain tile was also nominally round, but clay fired in a rural Nebraska drainage tile operation was not machined. It was formed by hand around a wooden mandrel, dried, fired in a kiln that maintained uneven temperatures, and the result was a cylinder that approximated roundness without achieving it. The gap between the stove collar's edge and the tile's interior rim was not uniform. In 2 places, it was wide enough to pass a finger. Smoke passing through that gap would not travel into the buried run. It would find the room instead, the path of least resistance being as always toward the people who needed it least. She went to Strick's that afternoon and asked the price of a stove elbow that might bridge the transition. Strick looked at her across the counter with an expression that was not satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Cash only for the Bodell account. The elbow was $1.60. She had $9, every one of which stood between her children and the particular despair of having no options at all. She left without the elbow. She walked back to the claim in the dark, the temperature somewhere below 0, the stars hard and close in the way they get in Nebraska when the air has had every particle of moisture stripped out of it. The claim shanty glowed faintly from the stove's evening ration. She stood outside it for a moment, looking at that light, thinking about the gap between the collar and the tile. Then she went inside, put more wood on the fire, and sat on the floor beside the trench and looked at the problem until the lamp burned too low to justify keeping it lit. That was the only night she did not work. She sat with the problem and could not move it, which was different from not knowing what to do. She knew exactly what she needed. She simply had no means of obtaining it, which is a more particular kind of helplessness. The stove ticked as it cooled. She put her hand on the dirt floor beside the open trench and said very quietly to no one, or perhaps to Callum, or perhaps to the Nebraska ground itself. Not yet. Jonas Pell arrived the following afternoon on foot, which was how Jonas arrived everywhere, since the section gang didn't provide horses, and he had never saved enough to buy one. He was 34 and had been a blacksmith for the Burlington Railroad section crew north of Atkinson for 2 years, ever since his wife Margaret had died of typhoid in Illinois, and he had loaded his tools into a single trunk and taken the first westbound train without a particular destination in mind. He lived in a sod-walled section shed near the rail line alone, in the way that men live alone when they have decided that the alternative requires more faith than they currently have available. His coat had torn from the collar to the waist seam sometime in the previous week, a clean rip along a stress line that had been developing since October. And it was a railroad blacksmith's coat, heavy canvas over wool flannel, irreplaceable in Holt County, without a trip to Atkinson that would require wearing the torn coat in temperatures that made the torn coat a liability. He had heard through the section gang's reliable distribution of regional information that the widow Bodell could sew a straight line and might trade labor for labor. He came to the door with the torn coat under his arm. He looked at the trench when she opened the door. He looked at the row of clay tiles beside it, at the stone pile by the east wall, at the ash drawing still visible on the table. His eyes moved the way a craftsman's eyes move across an unfamiliar problem, not dismissing it, not accepting it, simply reading it the way you read grain in a piece of iron before you commit to a stroke. Then he stepped inside and crouched beside the stove collar where it met the first tile and studied the gap. "I have scrap tin in 3 hours." His voice matter of fact, the voice of a transaction being proposed between equals. "You have a needle and thread." Cersei looked at the gap. She looked at the scrap tin leaning against the wall, a section of old stovepipe Callum had saved, intending some repair that the fall had not allowed him to complete. She looked at Jonas. He was not offering charity. She understood this immediately, which was the condition under which she could accept the help. He needed a coat. She had a needle. The exchange was clean. He worked for 3 hours, heating sections of the scrap tin on the stovetop, hammering them against a flat stone outside in the cold, reheating. Hammering again. The shape that emerged was not beautiful. It was a flared collar, wider at one end to meet the tile's interior diameter, fitted at the other to slip over the stove collar's exterior rim with a lip around the bottom edge that could be packed with clay. An ugly piece of metal made from salvaged materials by a man working with a hammer on frozen ground. It fit. While he worked, Saoirse sat on the bed with his coat in her lap and found the stress points along the rip, 3 places where the canvas had worn thin before the seam gave predictable failure points that she reinforced with doubled thread before closing the main tear with a backstitch tight enough to outlast the coat's other seams. Finn watched Jonas through the bed frame rungs with the complete attention of a 4-year-old observing something that made noise. Wren watched with the attention of someone cataloging a technique for later use. When Jonas left with his coat, he said nothing about returning. He had seen a problem solved, the portion of it that his skills addressed, completed the agreed exchange, and departed. Wren watched him go down the track road and asked if he was coming back. Saoirse said she didn't know. Wren considered this. "His hands look like the stove," Wren said. "On the outside." Saoirse looked at the collar Jonas had left on the table. The metal was rough, the surface pocked from hammer work on frozen stone. It was exactly right. She fitted the collar that evening. The flared end seated against the tile, the fitted end went over the stove collar's rim. She packed the lip with wet clay mixed with ash from the firebox floor. She held her cheek close to the joint and felt for air movement. Nothing. She pressed the clay in tighter at 2 points where she could feel the faintest cold breath of outside air infiltrating along the seam. Nothing after that. The connection held. The trench had a beginning. Hilda Voss came 3 days later on a morning when the temperature had not climbed above 12 degrees since the previous Thursday. She was 58 years old, short, built in the way of women who have been cold for decades, dense, economical of movement, wearing more layers than seemed possible, given her apparent slimness. She had come from Appalachian, Pennsylvania, as a young widow, settled in Holt County, midwifed more than she could accurately count, set bones-dosed fevers, and buried 3 of her own children before they reached 10 years old. Her father had been a stonemason in the western Pennsylvania mountains, hired by the mining companies to build and maintain the stone warming huts and flue channels in the coal tunnels above Connellsville, where the cold was a different problem than Nebraska cold, but the physics were the same. Hilda had learned the physics from her father's hands before she was old enough to have a word for physics. She examined Finn first. She pressed her ear to his chest and listened for a long time without speaking. Chest tight, breath shallow, no fever yet. But the rattle was deep and had established itself as a permanent resident rather than a passing visitor. She boiled water on the stove, added dried sage from her coat pocket, draped a flour sack over Finn's head and shoulders, and the steaming pot, and told him to breathe slowly. He complied with the seriousness of a child who understands that the person giving instructions has done this before. Then she turned to the table and saw the ash drawing. She did not ask what it was. She stood over it for perhaps 30 seconds, reading it, the trench line, the tile positions, the slope markings, the chimney notation at the north wall, the clean-out symbols Saoirse had scratched with a nail. Then she asked precisely, "Where is your clean-out?" The question arrived with the weight of a woman who had seen what happened when a buried flue had no access. Saoirse pointed to the two marks on the drawing cap crockery ports, one near the stove collar, one near the chimney base. Hilda nodded once. She asked about the chimney height. She asked about the tile slope. She picked up a piece of quartzite from the stone pile and knocked it against a second piece, listening. She set aside a piece of layered shale without comment. "Your father knew stone," she said, not as a compliment, as an observation, as a way of explaining how Saoirse had arrived at a design that made structural sense. Saoirse started to explain about the bake room in Pittsburgh. Hilda raised one hand. "You don't need to explain how you know. You need to explain how you will keep the smoke moving." What followed was not a lesson in the conventional sense. Hilda did not lecture. She demonstrated, then required repetition, then corrected. She twisted a bundle of dry grass, lit it, held it inside the base of the chimney frame. Saoirse had begun roughing at the north wall, allowing the burning bundle to heat the air inside the cavity. Then she told Saoirse to hold a goose feather produced from the same coat pocket that had contained the sage near the stove collar where the buried run would begin. The feather leaned, not toward the room, toward the collar. The chimney was already pulling even at 7 feet of framed height, even without the tiles below providing any pressure differential. The system existed as a concept, and the concept was already working. When it pulls, Hildy's voice flat with the authority of demonstrated fact, it draws air through the entire path, through the stove, through the buried tiles, up the stack. If the feather leans toward the room, the chimney is dead, and you have smoke in your house. She made Saoirse perform the test 3 times. The chimney needed to be taller, Hilda said. The current 7 feet was insufficient for the wind conditions she had observed in Holt County. 9 feet minimum. 12 was safer. The clay lesson came next, and it was the most precise thing Hilda taught because the clay was where most failures began. Creek clay from the east bank of the Niobrara tributary, a quarter-mile away, mixed with ash from the stove's firebox floor, combined with dried grass cut to half-inch lengths, and kneaded into the mixture until it reached a specific consistency. Not the consistency of wet mud, not the consistency of dry crumble, but the consistency of something that tore when you pulled it rather than smearing or cracking. Tearing meant the grass fiber had distributed through the clay matrix and would hold the joint together through the shrinkage of drying. Every joint in the buried run required this mixture packed with a butter paddle until no gap remained. You miss one joint. Hilda's eyes finding Saoirse's with complete directness. The one you miss is the one that opens at 3 in the morning. Stone selection consumed the better part of 2 days. Hilda rejected every piece of wet shale, every stone with visible layering, every piece of sandstone that gave slightly when she pressed her thumbnail into it. She kept the quartzite, the granite, the smooth glacial cobbles that rang clearly when struck together. The rejected pile grew nearly as large as the accepted one. "You are not building a wall," she repeated at intervals, the sentence carrying the weight of a principle that could not be stated once and relied upon. "You are building something that must drink heat, hold it, and return it without failing." Bad stone cracks. Cracked stone creates passages. Passages kill. The construction moved through the days like the trench itself, 1 foot at a time, each foot resisting. Saoirse cut the remaining trench length, while Hilda tested tile joints with her thumb, rejecting 3 that passed the visual inspection, but failed the pressure test requiring the clay to be scraped clean, remixed, repacked. Wren carried stones from the washing bucket to the trench in both arms, setting each one with care. Finn counted from the bed between coughing. The total passed 200 stones before his voice gave out again. On December 20th, Saoirse's hands blistered through the existing calluses. By the 22nd, the blisters had broken. She wrapped her palms in strips cut from a flour sack, changed the wrapping when the blood soaked through, but kept working. She was eating less, the digging demanded her time more urgently than cooking did, and porridge twice a day was sufficient to maintain the work, if not comfortable. Her dress hung differently at the waist. The muscles along her forearms had changed texture, become something harder than they had been. The stove collar gave trouble on December 22nd. The clay she had packed around Jonas's transition piece had dried with a shrinkage crack, a gap the width of a pencil lead running along the upper seam where the curve of the collar met the flat face of the tile. She tried repacking it. The new clay would not bond to the dried surface of the old clay. The moisture differential prevented adhesion, and the joint was in a position she could not reach properly with the butter paddle. She sat in the trench at midnight with her back against the tile wall and breathed slowly, pressing her hands flat on her thighs until they steadied enough to attempt the seal again. The second attempt held better, but not completely. She could feel the faintest movement of air at one point along the seam when she held her cheek against it. Jonas returned on December 23rd. He had heard from 2 men on the section gang who had heard from Dorothy Haas's husband that the collar joint was opening. He arrived because the collar was something he had made, which meant its failure was a problem that belonged partly to him, which was a category of problem Jonas Pell addressed without being asked. He heated the collar lip on the stove until it was workable, spread it slightly with a hammer blow against the flat stone, a fraction of a millimeter enough to change the compression angle, then packed the seam with a clay mixture he had brought, finer grained, mixed with sand rather than ash, which he said would grip the dried surface better than fresh creek clay. He had learned this watching a mason repair a railroad bridge abutment in Iowa 2 years before Margaret died. The seal held. Saoirse held her cheek to the joint for a full minute. Nothing moved. On Christmas morning, Saoirse gave each child a piece of horehound candy she had been keeping since October, wrapped in a square of cloth in the bottom of the flour sack where she kept the household money. She read from the Psalms beside the open trench while the stove burned its ration. Wren asked why they hadn't gone to the church service in Atkinson. Saoirse said God could hear them from this claim as clearly as from any building, and she believed it. And the believing made the statement true regardless of its theology. Wren looked at the trench. When it works, she said not if, but when, with the conviction of someone who has carried enough stones to have earned an opinion, will the floor be warm all night? If I sealed the joints, Saoirse told her, the floor remembers what the fire told the stones. That's the whole design. Wren thought about this for the length of time it took to unwrap the candy. Then she lay down on the floor beside the trench and pressed her ear against the packed earth. I'm listening too, she said. The first smoke test came on December 27th. Hilda was present, having arrived that morning with 2 pieces of dried venison in her coat pocket that she set on the table without mentioning. The fire was small, the driest cottonwood Saoirse had split, thin stacked tight, so it would catch fast and burn hot rather than smoldering. The whole design depended on hot smoke, not thick smoke. A lazy fire deposited creosote in the tiles and killed the draft by narrowing the passage over time. Hilda had said this on 3 separate occasions, which was how Saoirse knew it was the most important single rule. The fire caught, the stove roared, smoke filled the firebox, rose to the collar, hit Jonas's transition piece, entered the horizontal run. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The tiles were cold, the stones were cold, the chimney cavity was cold. There was no heat differential to create draft, no pressure gradient to move the smoke forward. The system sat with smoke at its entrance like a sentence waiting for its predicate. The first thread of smoke appeared at the 3rd tile joint, a faint gray seeping outward, finding the gap that the thumb test had passed, but the actual pressure of trapped smoke revealed. Then at the 5th joint, a second thread. The room began to haze at the level of the children's breathing. Wren pulled Finn to the far corner of the room away from the trench. Finn pressed his face against Wren's shoulder. Saoirse reached for the stove damper to close the fire down. "Wait!" Hilda was already at the north wall, crouched at the base of the chimney frame, a burning twist of dry grass in her hand, which she held inside the chimney cavity at floor level. The burning grass heated the air inside the stack. Warm air rose. Rising air created a pressure drop at the base of the chimney. The pressure drop reached backward. 30 seconds. The thread of smoke at the fifth joint reversed. It pulled inward rather than seeping outward. The chimney was beginning to draw. The draft was building. The pull was extending its reach back through 14 feet of buried tile and collecting the smoke that had nowhere else to go. Hilda lit a second grass twist from the burning end of the first and held it in the same position. The thread at the third joint thinned, wavered, reversed. The room cleared in the space of 3 minutes. The stove burned. The smoke traveled its buried path, invisible under the sod floor, and exited through the vertical chimney at the north wall. The third joint had leaked. Hilda marked it with a nail scratch on the capstone above it. She told Saoirse to let the system cool completely, then remove only the stones above that section, scrape the old clay from the joint surfaces, repack with fresh mixture, replace the stones. Wait 48 hours. They tested again on December 28th. The same small hot fire, the same 10 seconds of held breath, no thread at the third joint, no thread anywhere. The room stayed clear, the chimney pulled clean. Saoirse placed her hand on the floor above the trench near the midpoint of the run. 40 minutes after the fire started, the packed earth above the stones was warm. Not stove hot, not the aggressive warmth of a roaring fire, but warm in a way that Nebraska dirt floors in late December were not supposed to be warm. She let the fire die. An hour later, the stove iron had cooled to room temperature. The floor above the trench remained warm. 2 hours after that, at midnight, she removed her wool stockings and stood barefoot on the clay ridge above the buried stones. The warmth rose through the packed earth into the soles of her feet, and she stood there in the cold room with the dead stove and the sleeping children, and felt what the fire had left behind in the stone patient. Persistent, indifferent to the fact that the flame was gone, holding what it had been given, and returning it slowly to the room that needed it. Finn slept through the night without coughing. This did not mean they would survive. It meant the design was real, which was a different statement, and Saoirse understood the difference precisely. Dorothy came the next morning not to apologize for her skepticism. She was not a woman who led with apology, but to press her own palm against the warm clay ridge and stand there for a long time without speaking. "A warm floor on a still night is not a blizzard," she said finally. Which was true, which was the most important thing either of them could have said, because the blizzard was the test that mattered, and it had not yet arrived. Amos Greer heard the results from 2 men at Strix who had heard from Dorothy's husband. He came to the claim and pressed his carpenter's palm against the clay ridge and frowned. Not because the warmth was doubtful, but because it was unambiguous. An unambiguous warmth from a buried pipe under a dirt floor was a thing that 30 winters of building straight chimneys had not prepared him to encounter without resistance. The system may pull today and reverse tomorrow, his voice carrying the precision of a man who has been right about chimneys for a long time and is not ready to surrender the entirety of that record. Temperature changes affect draft. A northwest wind across that chimney cap will push smoke backward. You have tested this on still nights in moderate cold. You have not tested it in a blizzard. He was right. Strick had his own verdict delivered at the counter to anyone who would hear it. She was wasting fuel heating rocks instead of air. When the real cold arrived, those rocks would be cold, and the claim would be for sale at back tax prices by March. He was not yet wrong. The distinction between not yet wrong and never wrong was the distance between December and January. Outside, the sky to the northwest had been the color of old lead for 4 days. Along the Niobrara, according to the section gang's reports coming down the rail line, the water had dropped below the level where it usually dropped only in the hardest weeks of February. The animals were behaving in the particular way animals behave when they understand what is coming before the instruments do. The woodpile stood at just under half a cord. The stones held heat for 3 hours after a hot fire. The joints were sealed. The chimney stood at 9 feet of vertical rise, which Hilda had accepted as sufficient with a silence that meant she would have preferred 12. January was 8 days away. What January intended was not yet visible, but the sky to the northwest had been making its argument for 4 days, and the prairie had been listening, and Cyrus Bedell had sealed every joint she could reach, and built the chimney as tall as the materials allowed, and burned nothing but hot, clean fires, and whatever came next was coming whether she was ready or not. She opened the clean-out port behind the stove and looked inside with the lamp. The tiles were clean, the draft was pulling, the stones were warm. She closed the port and fed the stove its evening ration and went to bed with her children on the warm floor above the trench, which was still the only thing in Holt County that anyone had seen warm itself from the inside out. The morning of January 12th arrived with a lie. The temperature had climbed overnight from the sustained bitter cold of the previous 2 weeks to something that felt by Nebraska standards almost forgiving. Snow melted at the window edges. The wind had dropped to nothing. The sky was a flat, pale white that could have meant almost anything, but felt for the first morning in weeks like it meant nothing dangerous. Saoirse opened the door and breathed air that did not cut. And Finn stood beside her in the doorway and laughed because the cold did not reach into his chest the way it had been reaching for months. Wren asked to go to school. Saoirse stood in the doorway for a moment with the mild air on her face and made the calculation she had been making every morning for 3 weeks. Keeping Wren home invited questions from the schoolteacher, from the Millstone trustees, from Dorothy, from everyone who was already watching the Bodell claim for signs that the widow was unsteady. Missing school was evidence. Evidence fed the story Strick was quietly maintaining. She looked at the white sky and made the wrong decision for the right reasons. She let Wren go walking east with Emma Haas along the track road toward Millstone Schoolhouse, a mile and a half in weather that felt like a gift. At noon, Saoirse fired the stove with a hard, hot charge. The driest split cottonwood she had, thin pieces stacked for fast combustion rather than slow smolder. The smoke pulled clean through the collar, through the buried run up the north wall chimney without hesitation. She closed the damper halfway after 20 minutes, let the fire burn down to deep coals, felt the floor warming under her feet as she moved around the room. The stones were drinking. She had fuel for the evening burn, plus 3 more days beyond that, which was not enough to see February, but was enough to matter if the stones could carry the room through the hours between burns. At 2 in the afternoon, the sky changed. It did not darken the way storms usually announce themselves across the open prairie building, in gradual layers from a distant threat to a proximate one. The white sky simply thickened. The pale ceiling acquired weight, acquired direction, became a wall rather than a ceiling, and the wall was moving from the northwest at a speed that made the remaining daylight feel like something being actively taken. The temperature dropped not in degrees but in character. The mild morning air replaced by something that tasted of iron that moved through the tar paper wall and through the gaps in the framing, not as drafts but as a single coordinated pressure, as if the cold had organized itself. The wind arrived with the drop. Not the steady prairie wind that Saoirse had learned to discount, but a horizontal force that drove snow so fine it was not snow, but ice suspended in moving air, a white blindness that erased the world outside the window between one breath and the next. She could not see the fence post 10 feet from the door. She could not see the cow pen. The track road where Wren had walked east that morning had ceased to exist as a visible thing. She fed the stove immediately, the largest single charge she had ever put in the firebox stacked tight with the wood split thinnest, the draft opened fully. The fire caught fast and roared. The smoke rose to the collar, hit the transition piece, entered the buried run. For 3 seconds, the wind's force against the chimney cap outside interrupted the draw. She felt it in the stove's behavior. The slight pressure changed the fire, momentarily uncertain of its direction. Then the 9-foot stack asserted itself over the wind's interference. The draft reestablished, the smoke moved forward through the tiles. The stones began receiving what the fire was sending. Finn screamed from the bed, not from cold, from the sound. The wind against the shanty walls was louder than anything he had encountered, louder than thunder. A sustained roar that had no pause in it, no breath, no variation that would suggest it intended to stop. Saoirse crossed the room in 4 steps, picked him up, held him against her chest with one hand over his near ear. The door opened. Dorothy Haas's oldest boy, 15, came through it trailing a comet's tail of horizontal snow that swept across the floor and vanished. His eyebrows were white. His left ear had a bright line of blood along the upper rim, where windblown ice had found skin. He had come from the direction of Millstone Schoolhouse. He was alone. His voice was flat with the particular flatness of someone delivering information he does not want to deliver. Teacher tried to hold everyone inside. Two ran when the white came. Your girl, Emma. Sorsey set Finn on the bed. She looked at Dorothy's boy, at his frost-whitened face, at the blood on his ear, at the direction from which he had come. She did not ask questions whose answers she already possessed. Wren was east, a mile and a half east, in a whiteout that had already erased everything within 10 feet of the door. She crossed to the wall where the clothesline was coiled on its hook, 30 feet of braided cotton rope that had hung between the shanty and the fence post since October, taken down in November, kept inside because the cold made rope brittle. She looped one end around the stove's base leg 3 times, knotted it with the same hitch Callum had used for the wagon traces, and wrapped the coil around her forearm. She told Dorothy's boy to stay with Finn, to keep the door sealed, to feed the stove 1 small charge in an hour if she had not returned. She put on Callum's coat. It was too large across the shoulders, the sleeves 2 inches long over her wrists, and it smelled of cottonwood sap. She put it on because it was the warmest thing in the shanty, and the fit did not matter. The wind hit her the moment the door opened, a wall of moving ice that struck her full in the face and chest and tried to take her sideways. She stepped into it, pulled the door shut behind her, felt the rope pay out from her forearm as she moved toward where the fence post should be. The world was white in every direction, including down the ground and the air, were the same substance, the same color, indistinguishable. She moved by memory of the fence's location, found the post by collision with her hip, grabbed the wood with both hands while the wind tried to peel her loose. She followed the fence east, hand over hand post, to post the rope trailing behind her into the white. 30 feet of rope. She reached the end of it before the fence ended, tied the free end to the post she was holding, and released it. Now she was untethered. The shanty was somewhere behind her, in the white she could not see. It could not hear anything above the wind's continuous roar. The fence continued east. She followed it by touch post to post, her bare hands finding the wire by feel, the wire cutting into fingers she could no longer feel as fingers. The fence ended at the property line. Beyond it was open prairie, no reference, nothing but the wind on her left cheek indicating northwest, which meant east was to her right. She turned right into the white and moved forward on her hands and knees, because upright she had no way of knowing if she was drifting south. She found Wren by sound. Not by sight, there was no sight. Not by touch, though touch came a moment later. She found her by a sound that reached her through the wind's roar, through the ice, through the white blindness, and that sound was a cough. Not any cough, the specific cough that had lived in Saoirse's nights for 4 months. The hollow, rattling intake followed by the tight exhale, the sound she had learned to track through sleep and darkness and distraction. Finn's cough, produced in this moment by Wren. The girl was lying on the ground with her back to the wind and both arms around Emma Haas, 9 years old. Both of them past the shaking stage and into the stillness that arrives when the body begins allocating resources away from the extremities. Wren had heard her mother calling Saoirse, had not known she was calling, had not registered her own voice above the wind, and had done the only thing she could think of to make herself findable. She had made the sound she knew her mother could not sleep through. She had made Finn's sound. 7 years old, lying in a Nebraska blizzard with another child in her arms, she had used the only signal she was certain would cut through anything her mother was experiencing. Saoirse pulled Callum's coat off and wrapped it around both children, got them upright, positioned herself behind them as a windbreak for the turn west. The wind that had been on her left cheek coming east was now on her right. She pushed the children in front of her bent forward knees to the ground, moving through the white toward where the fence had to be. The rope was there. She felt it against her shoulder before she saw it. The braided cotton stiff with cold but intact, still tied to the fence post where she had left it. She grabbed it, followed it post to post, back to the shanty wall, found the door by feel, got it open. Hilda Voss was inside. She had arrived 20 minutes earlier to check on Finn and been caught by the storm's sudden arrival. She had assessed the situation immediately upon arriving and done what it required. She fired the stove with one short, fierce charge, the hottest clean burn she could manage with the remaining dry wood, then closed the draft and let the stones take everything the fire had to give. The firebox was coals now. The stove iron was cooling. The floor above the trench was the warmest surface in the room. They stripped both girls of their outer clothes. Emma's lips carried the blue undertone that Hilda recognized from 30 years of treating cold injury, and Hilda wrapped her in every quilt in the shanty and positioned her directly on the clay ridge above the trench where the heat rose with the most consistency. Wren's fingers showed white at the tips, frostbite beginning not established, and Hilda rubbed them with cloths warmed on the stoveplate, working the circulation back with the patient friction of someone who has done this before and knows that hurrying the process causes more damage than the cold did. The stove died. Saoirse fed it hay twists, then the remaining cow chips, coaxing one more charge through the buried run. The hay burned fast, the chips smoldered, the smoke moved weakly through the tiles and into the stones that were already warm from the noon fire. The floor held. At 9 o'clock, the door shook with the force of someone who had not the strength to knock. Amos Greer and Dorothy Haas came through it, holding each other's arms for balance, both of them having walked and stumbled and been pushed sideways from Amos's claim a quarter-mile west. Amos's left cheek was white. Dorothy's hands were inside her coat. She was crying without making the sounds of crying, which is the way of women who have been frightened past the point where sound adds anything useful. Amos's chimney cap had iced over in the wind, and the draft had reversed, filling his room with smoke. He had tried to force it with a hot fire, packing the firebox with green willow, and the smoke had won. They had left his shanty and walked toward the only light they could find in the white, which was the faint orange glow of the Bodell stove through the window. Amos stepped inside and stopped. He stood in the doorway with the blizzard screaming behind him and breathed the air inside the room, which smelled of clay, of ash, of wet wool, of children's hair, of the specific domestic exhaustion of a room that had been holding people for hours. It did not smell of smoke. He looked at the stove, nearly dark firebox cooling. He looked at the north wall chimney still pulling, the faint sound of the draft audible even above the wind, because the wind could not reach the horizontal portion of the run, could not reverse what lived inside the earth. Then he looked down. He took off one glove. He pressed his bare palm to the floor. 7 people in a 16 by 20-foot shanty. The stove had been functionally dead for 2 hours. The temperature outside had passed through 0 and was still falling. The floor was warm. Not warm the way a heated floor in a city building was warm, but warm the way a living thing was warm. Steady, present, persisting without requiring anything further from anyone. The children slept on the clay ridge. The adults sat with their backs against the walls and their feet extended toward the warmth. Finn lay with his cheek pressed against the earth above the stones and breathed without coughing, the deepest, quietest breathing he had managed since October. At midnight, Saoirse pressed her thermometer against the clay ridge, 61 degrees at floor level. The air near the ceiling was 48. Outside the walls, it was 12 below 0. The differential was not an accident. It was the result of every joint she had sealed, every stone Hilda had made her sort twice, every clean-out port she had installed, when she could have skipped it, every decision made correctly in the weeks when no one believed the decisions mattered. Amos said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying that the thermometer had not already said. The storm blew for 36 hours. When it stopped, the silence was so complete that Saoirse thought something had gone wrong with her hearing, until Finn made a sound in his sleep. She opened the door onto a world that had been remade overnight, into white geometry drifts, covering the fence to the top rail. The cow pen reduced to a smooth mound with one corner post breaking the surface. The track road entirely gone. The sky was blue, hard and cold, in the way that follows a great storm, as if the atmosphere had expelled everything it contained. Amos left first, walking without speaking, his frost-bitten cheek wrapped in a strip of quilt Saoirse had cut without asking his preference. Dorothy followed with her son, moving east toward her own claim, which they would find intact but frozen through stove-cold water, bucket-solid bedding stiff with frost. Hilda stayed through the morning, watching Emma's color return from blue through red to the pink of restored circulation, watching the girl eat porridge with the focused attention of someone rediscovering that food exists. 3 days later, Amos came back with his carpenter's pencil and a strip of birch bark he used for figuring. He measured the floor temperature against his own. His shanty 12 degrees at floor level after a full morning of burning. The Bedell claimed 54 degrees at the clay ridge 4 hours after Saoirse's last fire. He wrote both numbers on the birch bark and looked at them for a long time. Then he sat at the table and said what the numbers had shown him, in the voice of a man recounting what the evidence required rather than what he preferred. I spent 30 winters building chimneys that threw heat away. I was wrong about what the smoke could give before it climbed. I was not wrong about the danger. What you built was dangerous. It worked because every joint held, because the chimney was tall enough to pull in wind, because you burn clean and never lazy. Do not let anyone build this without understanding that. A pause settled between them. If they had found one joint to fault in the execution, the design would have killed your children. Do not let anyone forget that part either. He left. The next time he spoke about Saoirse in public at Strick's counter in front of 6 men, he said only, "Pay attention when she speaks." The men looked at him. He offered no elaboration, which was the most emphatic thing Amos Greer could do. Hilda Voss died in April. She had delivered a baby on a homestead 12 miles west in a late-season sleet storm. The same type of wet cold that had killed more people slowly than the hard winter cold killed them quickly. And by the time she returned to her own soddy, the infection had established itself in her lungs. It moved the way pneumonia moves in a person who has been worn by decades of outdoor work, steadily without drama, claiming ground each day, without announcing the advance. Saoirse brought broth. Hilda drank it and told her she was wasting time that could be spent checking cleanouts. Saoirse checked the cleanouts and sat beside Hilda's bed and did not leave. Hilda's last active day was a Tuesday in late March. She sat wrapped in quilts in Saoirse's shanty while Saoirse demonstrated the maintenance procedure to 2 neighboring women who were building a bench system for their own claims. Hilda watched without speaking for an hour. Then one of the women referred to the buried run as a smoke path, and Hilda's voice came from the quilts with the precision it had always carried. Not smoke path, heat path. The smoke is the horse. The heat is the cargo. You are not building a road for smoke. You are building a road for heat. She closed her eyes. The 2 women looked at each other and said nothing. She died on the 4th of April in her own bed with Saoirse holding her hand. The pneumonia had moved with such deliberate steadiness that the end came as a long exhalation rather than a crisis. Saoirse returned to the shanty alone after the burial and found what she had not noticed in the months of daily use in the clean-out port behind the stove, where the crockery cap seated in its clay cradle. There was a handprint pressed into the wet clay from the day they had installed it 4 months earlier. Hilda's hands, smaller than Saoirse's, the fingers closer together, dried now into the wall of the trench as permanently as any other feature of the construction. Saoirse did not smooth it away. She replaced the crockery cap and closed the port and sat on the floor with her back against the cooling stove until the light left the window. After that, every time she opened that port to clean it every week, as Hilda had insisted, her fingers found the impression. It fit around her own hand the way a space shaped by one person fits another, close, but not identical, a reminder of the difference between learning something and knowing it first. The community came in 1s and 2s through the summer of 1888 and into the fall. Dorothy built a stone bench along her sleeping wall, 4 feet of packed quartzite, with a short horizontal run connecting to a 9-foot chimney at the far end. Her children fought over the sleeping positions nearest the warm stones for 2 subsequent winters. The Millstone trustees, under Amos's supervision, installed a raised masonry platform along the schoolhouse's north wall. Salvaged brick over granite cobbles connected to the coal stove by 8 feet of horizontal run before venting up through an 11-foot chimney that Amos had argued should be 12. Miss Braden, the Millstone schoolteacher, adopted Saoirse's rule about lazy fires with the enthusiasm of a convert and checked the clean-out every Monday morning before the children arrived. The children who sat nearest the platform came to school earlier and stayed later than those at the far side of the room. They did not know why the floor was warm. They only required that it be. Each person who came to the Bodell claim received the same thing from Saoirse: the measurements, the slopes, the clean-out positions, the chimney minimum, the warnings stated plainly and repeated without apology. She refused to let anyone skip the warnings. When a homesteader from the next township asked for the design without what he called the lecture, Saoirse told him the lecture was the design. The stones were easy. The discipline was what kept a family alive. In October, the drought-dried grass caught a railroad crew spark west of Atkinson and pushed east with the wind at a speed that outran a horse on open ground. Strick's storage shed burned first the frame building with its inventory of flour, coal, oil, dry goods, and the coal pile that had been his primary seasonal asset. The community gathered at Millstone Schoolhouse because it stood on the widest cleared ground. 30 people, then more. Someone lit the coal stove for warmth as the evening cooled after the fire front passed, and within an hour the chimney cap had clogged with the fine ash that the prairie fire had suspended across everything for miles. The draft weakened. Smoke from the coal stove began seeping from the platform's joints rather than pulling through the run and up the stack. Amos wanted the windows open. Dorothy thought the outside air would flood the room with smoke from the smoldering fields. Strick, who had come inside with his ledgers, and his nephew, said this was exactly what he had predicted, that the buried system was a death trap, and they were all going to suffer for it. Saoirse was at the cleanout port before he finished speaking. She opened the first access cap and inserted the hooked iron rod she had made for this purpose, based on the maintenance tool Hilda had specified in December. Inside, the port fine ash had built a partial dam against the first tile joint, narrowing the passage. She scraped it forward in sections, working the hook through each blockage until she could feel the air moving freely again past the rod's tip. She closed the port, moved to the chimney base cleanout. More ash drifted in from outside during the hours the chimney had been drawing smoke-laden air. She cleared it, pulled the accumulated ash into a bucket, closed the port. She took a twist of dry grass from the supply near the stove, lit it, held it inside the chimney base, held the goose feather kept in her coat pocket since December near the stove collar. The feather hung still for 2 seconds. Then it leaned, inward, toward the collar, toward the buried run. The smoke reversed within 4 minutes. The room cleared. The platform began radiating again. The stones still warm from the evening's fire, doing what stones did when they had been built correctly and maintained without exception. 30 people moved toward the floor, toward the warmth settling around the platform, in the shifting arrangements of exhausted people, finding the temperature that their bodies required. Strick watched this from the corner where he sat with his ledgers. His storage shed was ash. His coal pile was smoldering ruins in the dark outside. His seasonal profit was gone. The system he had spent months undermining was the reason his nephew was warm and his ledgers were dry. He said nothing for a long time. He came to the Bodell claim the following week at dusk, without his fur-collared coat, lost in the shed fire, wearing plain wool that made him look like the county he had come from, rather than the business he had built. He stood in the doorway, which was where Saoirse had always received him, and he asked what a proper heat path would cost for the new storage shed he intended to build. Saoirse looked at him. She could see in the set of his jaw the specific effort of a man who has decided to pay a cost he considers unfair, but is calculated to be less than the alternative. She did not make the calculation easier for him. She also did not make it harder. She picked up a stick of kindling and drew the design in the ash on the table, the same drawing she had given Dorothy, given Amos, given the schoolhouse trustees. The measurements, the slopes, the clean-out positions, the chimney minimum. She gave it to him for free. He looked at the drawing. He looked at her. He folded the paper with care and put it inside his coat. "I'll need ironwork." "Jonas forges the collars," she told him. "I know who forges the collars," he said and left. The following week, a man from the eastern part of the county made a joke at Strick's counter. He had heard the dead snake story secondhand and thought it was entertainment. He was laughing when Strick set down the can he was shelving and turned to look at him with an expression that had nothing warm in it. "Pay attention when she speaks," Strick said. "It will cost less than not listening." The man stopped laughing. Everyone in the store stopped talking. Strick picked up the can and continued working. That was the conversion of Ward Strick, not warmth, not admission, not the dramatic surrender of a man who has seen the error of his position. Just the quiet arithmetic of a man who had calculated the price of his stubbornness and found it higher than he was willing to pay. The following spring brought Saoirse improvements she had been considering through the winter. She added a second cleanout port at the midpoint of the buried run, where soot accumulated heaviest. She raised the outside chimney by 3 feet using salvaged brick that Amos hauled from a demolished outbuilding in Atkinson. The additional height cost her 2 days of labor and bought her draft that held steady even when the northwest wind drove hard across the chimney cap. Jonas Pell came on a Saturday in April of 1890 with a piece of iron he had made without being commissioned. It was small, a cover plate the size of a large man's palm, a hole drilled through one corner for the fastening pin, the letters SB stamped into the face with a punch set and filed smooth at the edges. For the first cleanout port, he said, so anyone who opens it knows whose system it is. Saoirse turned it in her hands. The ironwork was clean, far cleaner than the collar he had forged in December on frozen stone, which had been the work of urgency. This was something he had taken time with, returning to the same shape with repeated strikes until the proportions were right. She hung it on the wall beside Hilda's cleanout hook, beside the scraping rod, beside the measuring template Jonas had made months earlier. 3 iron tools, a sentence written in metal about who had built this thing, who had taught it, who had maintained it through every storm since. Jonas stood at the door with his hat in his hands. The claim has a name on it, he said. It does, she told him. He looked at the hat in his hands the way he looked at a piece of iron he was working toward, through heat, through repetition, through returning to the same point until the shape declared itself. I was thinking whether it might want another name beside it. Saoirse set the iron plate down on the table. She looked at him the way she looked at a joint she was testing, with the attention of someone who understood that some things held and some things failed, and the difference was in the materials in the making. Not over it, she said. Beside it, he confirmed. Between the plate and the wedding, there were 5 months of the same work they had always done. Iron-forged joints, sealed cleanouts, inspected the system, maintained with the weekly discipline Hilda had made non-negotiable. Their courtship was the accumulated weight of those Saturdays of problems solved together across the work table of the trust that builds between people who have seen each other work under pressure and found no reason to look away. They married in September of 1890 in the Lutheran Church in Atkinson, with Wren as witness and Finn as ring-bearer, and Amos Greer in the second pew, with his arms folded and his face unreadable, which was his way of showing that something had turned out correctly. Dorothy brought bread. Strix sent a box that arrived the following morning containing a set of new stove bolts and a receipt for the Bodell account marked paid in full, which was the only apology he was constituted to make, and which Saoirse accepted in the spirit it was offered. The years that followed moved in the rhythm of the work. Saoirse bore a daughter with Jonas in the spring of 1893 named Ragna, who slept on the warm floor from her first night and grew up believing all floors were warm in winter, which was the kind of innocence that only a well-built house could produce. Wren became the Millstone schoolteacher in 1903, taking over from Miss Braden, and repeated her mother's rule about lazy fires whenever the school stove smoked. She checked the clean-out on the masonry platform every Monday morning before the children arrived. The children did not know why the teacher opened the little iron door in the wall and looked inside with a lamp. They did not need to know. They only needed the floor to be warm. Finn grew into a Holt County surveyor with an eye for slope that his colleagues considered uncanny. He walked property lines across the county for 30 years, and the men he worked with said he could tell a 1-inch rise across 40 feet without a level. They did not know where he had learned it. Finn knew, but he did not talk about the winter of 1888 the way some men talk about what they survived. He carried it the way the stones carried heat, silently and visibly, giving it back only when someone stood close enough to feel. In 1917, Saoirse Bodell Pell sat on the porch of the house that had replaced the shanty 4-frame walls, a shingled roof, a plank floor laid over the original dirt, and the trench that still ran beneath it, sealed and maintained. The cleanout ports opened every week by whoever was available. Across the section line, a young couple was installing a stovepipe through the roof of their claim shack. The husband tightened the collar and stood back with the satisfaction of a problem solved. Saoirse walked across. "How much heat do you plan to buy?" she asked him. "Just to throw it at the sky." He laughed, the generous laugh of a young man who thinks an old woman is making a small joke. His wife did not laugh. She looked at Saoirse with the recognition of someone who understands that something is being offered that she cannot yet evaluate but cannot afford to dismiss. Draw it for me, the young wife said. Circe picked up a stick from the frozen ground and drew in the earth. 14 feet, 2 feet wide, 30 inches deep, 1 inch of rise for every 4 feet of run. Cleanouts here. Chimney at the far end, 9 feet, minimum 12 is safer. She stood up and looked at the young wife who was looking at the drawing with the focus of someone committing it to memory. The stone doesn't care who built it, Saoirse told her. It only cares how well you sealed the joints. She walked back across the section line to her own house. Behind her, the drawing remained in the frozen Nebraska earth until the evening wind moved through and erased it. Under the floor of the Bodell Pell house, in the darkness below the plank boards, 3,000 pounds of glacial quartzite waited for the evening fire, the way they had waited every evening for 30 years, patient dense, holding the capacity for warmth, the way a word holds meaning before it is spoken. The stove would be lit in an hour, the stones would remember.